Hello and welcome to Agents of Nonprofit. My name is Alexander Lapa, and I'm here to speak with everyday superheroes helping nonprofits. Joining me today is Caroline Griffin to talk about donor-centric messaging. Caroline, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to chat with you.
So I love asking as we begin this episode with what is your superhero origin story?
Wow, I am humbled to be called a superhero. And the reason I work with nonprofits is because I wasn't talented enough to be on Broadway, which was my childhood dream. And as soon as I realized I was a big fish in a small high school theater pond, I quickly realized that I could use my love of communication in a different way and benefit people in a different way. So it started early for me.
That's cute, actually, because my brother's wife had a similar ambition. She was very talented singer, dancer, actor in Montreal, and she was really good at what she did. But then the minute she went to Broadway to do the schooling in New York, she realized all of a sudden there's a lot of really, really talented people out there. And now she became a big fish or a small fish in a big pond. But it's great that you're
Yeah.
able to translate that into something, keep the passion alive. The core passion, like you said, is communication, right? It's being able to express yourself in some way. And it's awesome you were able to find a way to do that in a very beneficial way. I mean, nonprofits are great, right?
Yes. And I need to also shout out my mother, who has run a treatment program where I grew up in Vermont for 40 plus years and instilled in me that desire to help others from a very young age.
Awesome. So she was the main influence on, like, because there's many different ways after your dreams were crushed. There are many different ways to be able to pivot. But okay, so was it your mom that actually encouraged you or influenced you to become and move toward nonprofits, or was there some other influence that said, nonprofits are where you might want to consider being?
I found it naturally. She did encourage me to study communications. It just felt like a natural fit because I always loved to write and I enjoyed public speaking. And she thought that was a little bit more practical than studying theater. And I tend to agree for myself. But as soon as I got to college, I was drawn to the nonprofit internships and the volunteer groups on campus. And I did a year of AmeriCorps right out of college. And it's just always what I've been drawn to, but probably because she modeled that for me growing up.
Awesome. So, as we're talking about donor-centric messaging, I'd love to also start by trying to give a definition for that so people can get aligned. I'm sure a lot of our listeners already know what that means, but maybe there might be a few that don't. So, when we talk about donor-centric messaging, what does that mean to you?
I'm glad we're defining this because I think sadly, a lot of organizations think that doing just a base level of personalization of their communication is checking this box. Like, oh, we use the first name merge tag in all of our emails. So we're donor centric. And that is just not going to cut it anymore. And the way I would define it is actually much deeper. It's about an organization having an ethos that investing in really knowing who their donors are, getting to know them on a deeper and deeper level, and having a true relationship with those individual people is a worthy investment of time and money and energy. And that impacts every aspect of the organization's operations, really. I also think of it in terms of the way we treat our own friends interpersonally. Like you wouldn't mass email or group text all your friends once a month and say, hey, here's what's going on with me. Thought you'd like to know. And that's what a lot of nonprofits do. And sadly, it's partly a lack of resources. If it's a team of two, sending out a monthly update is sometimes all they can muster. But that's how I approach it with my clients is like, okay, if this was a friendship, me and all of these donors, I want to know what are their individual interests, motivations, values, and segment and communicate with them that way as much as possible as a sign of respect and mutual caring, because we don't just reach out to our friends when we need a favor, when we want something from them. That's not a relationship. And it has to feel like a two-way street for donors to even remember your organization, stick around, let alone really feel connected.
You already mentioned a good point. How if you're a smaller nonprofit, starting, let's say, with two people, as you mentioned, it might be easier, or as a starting point, to be able to just blast off an email, a general email to a bunch of people, not personalized at all. And then it seems like there could be an evolution to getting from there, which is a very valid starting point, just because you got to focus on so many things at the same time. But using that as your starting point and evolving to something that's more, like you said, getting to know your donors and relationships. Do you normally see that kind of progression from a generic situation to a more specific one? And are there major steps along the way to get from point A to point Z or Z?
It's definitely an evolution, but I've also found that some of the smallest organizations and teams I worked with are the best at this. And it's how they spend their time. I've noticed that some of my clients, some are organizations of one or two people, and they're responding to all of the comments on their social media posts. They're replying to the direct email replies that they get. They're carving out time for that versus some of the larger organizations I work with. They've actually sort of engineered their way out of that personal touch and created less of a relationship because they are thinking bigger. They're thinking, oh, we have a list of 10, 20, 50,000 people. I don't know who any of them are individually.
I mean, which raises the question, how do you get to be somewhat personal with 20,000, 30,000 people? If it's a steady, slow growth, I guess you could, as a start to get to know your organization, you can start to get to know them. But I imagine that at some point there might be buckets of people, chunks of people coming in, and it might be like, how do you scale? I guess is the question.
It's a really good question. I do believe some of it can be automated and done with segmentation. And I mean, you know a whole lot about this, Alex, in terms of on the back end, how are we organizing people and communicating with them in buckets based on their relationship to the cause, how they found us, do they donate time, money, both? It's a sign of respect to know enough about them to at least communicate with them only about the things and in the way that they really care about. And that doesn't have to be one-on-one all the time. And then sort of layered on top of that, if someone in your organization does carve out some time to respond to things like email replies and comments on ads or social media posts directly, those things, those little moments make a huge difference and can keep someone sort of loyal for life. I can think of that feeling I felt if I've commented on a big nonprofit's Instagram post and got a personal reply, and that really stays with you.
Okay, so you mentioned a couple of tactics: responding to emails, responding to social media. I imagine basically any time of social media. If you're a nonprofit broadcasting on multiple channels, all of them are applicable. Monitoring those. You said it's also, I mean, it can be time intensive, especially if you've got so many, but if you have, is it normal to have one or two people or a percentage of people at the nonprofit who are focused on this? Or is it a part-time role that you find people switch in and out of?
Sadly, I don't know any organization where it's someone's full-time job to be stewarding those personal relationships online. I do think bigger organizations have people dedicated to like donor stewardship and retention, and they often focus on the people who give the most money, which, makes sense. But I also think it's just as important as maybe responding to those comments and those emails when you can, is also finding opportunities to conduct some audience research and ask donors questions about themselves to be able to segment them properly and communicate with them on the channels and in the ways that they want. I think about like my mom messages me on Facebook all the time. And every week I'm like, Mom, please stop messaging me there. I don't use Facebook. I don't want to be on there. Please text me instead. And we're working on it. We'll get there, but it's like people have their preferences and they just want to be reached in the places and at the times that work best for them. And the better we understand that, it really is a sign of respect for the donor.
I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second then, because I mean, time is obviously limited. You can't be everywhere all at once.
Yep.
So, sure, I think it makes sense if you're broadcasting on a social channel or any channel, you should definitely monitor that channel for activity and respond to it. But if it's a channel you don't normally go to or are not on and you're still getting that kind of feedback, I mean, is there a line that you should draw, or it's just like anytime you get any kind of feedback and you should be open to the idea of responding to it because any feedback is valuable?
Yeah, that's a great question. We can't do it all. We can't respond to everything, and we can't customize everything for each individual person. But we can learn from the themes that can start to bubble up if we're collecting this feedback and analyzing it as a group. So when I was in house at a nonprofit monitoring the social media channels, the email, and everything, I had this master spreadsheet where I would pull in every time someone left an interesting comment or replied to an email, I would paste those into that spreadsheet. And then once or twice a year, I would go in and kind of sort them into themes and see like, okay, is this teaching me anything about what our fans generally care about or like or dislike? What can I learn from this sort of social listening to influence how I'm sending out this communication? And sometimes there were really interesting nuggets in there. And now you could probably use AI to help with that process a lot, whereas I was doing all of that manually.
Yeah, we'll get to. I have definitely questions about AI a bit further down in the recording. But um, as you're talking about this, I was thinking about the question: is there an appropriate moment to start doing this? Because it might be easier. I would assume it's easier that if you're starting with two people, you only have a handful of donors that you need to talk to. It's very easy to be very, very personalized. And then as you get larger and larger, hopefully, because we all want to be larger and larger and have a bigger impact, that starts again the scaling problem. But I imagine there's also some organizations that have already 5, 10,000 donors or somewhere in that range, and they don't yet have information about them. Is there situations where they can start asking questions to get more information about them to be able to do that segmentation?
Yes, it's always an okay time to start conducting some audience research. Even if these donors or supporters have been on your list for years and you've never asked them these questions, it's okay now still to reach out and say, and this can be en masse, right? You don't need to send this to each individual person. You could, in January, send an email to a whole group of donors and say, you've been with us for a while. We're so grateful for you. We really need to know more about you. And would you answer these 3, 4, 5 questions so that we can better tailor your experience with us this year? People are never going to be mad about that.
Is there any other way to be able to effectively get this kind of information? Is sending an email like a survey? This sounds like a survey almost. Um, is it better to just send an email to refer them to like a Google form or some other kind of form tool? Like, have you noticed any particular ways that are better at eliciting responses than others? I mean, I guess phone calls could be another way, but that's obviously very manual. But you might get a higher
Yeah.
response rate. I don't know. These days, most people don't even bother answering their phones. I don't anymore. But the idea is, yeah, is there any particular strategy that works better than another?
Yes. In general, asking as few questions as possible and only asking for the information that you're absolutely going to use right away, no matter the channel. Email can work well, especially if you use a mail merge or something to make it feel like a true plain text email coming from a person and not some like designed generic feeling thing. I would also say that SMS is sorely underutilized by nonprofits. And when you use text messaging very sparingly to learn more about your donors, it has a 99% open rate compared to an email realistically being, 10, 20, 30%. I've never been annoyed to receive a text message asking one question for an organization to get to know me better and honor my preferences. Whereas I have been annoyed by nonprofits only using text to ask me for money, ask me for money. So it goes back to that friendship analogy. It's like, could you use something like a text message to actually deepen the relationship instead of just asking?
But 3 questions maximum, it sounds like. So you don't want to overwhelm them too much. And it also almost sounds like you could ask, or should you ask all three at the same time? Let's say if you're using SMS, if it's like that's 99% is huge. Would you see it as asking a single question? If they get a response, ask a second. If they get a response, ask the third, or just shoot all three at the same time and cross your fingers?
For a donor survey in general, I try to limit to 3 to 5 questions. If you're using text, there are actually ways of creating sort of like a branching system so that you start with one question. If they answer that question, you can have an automated reply asking a follow up and do it that way. But I think to keep it simple, especially in the beginning, if you're using text, it's like, okay, what is the one thing that would be most helpful for us to know? And let's just ask one question. And let's do that once every few months and spread it out instead of possibly annoying them and then they might unsubscribe.
I've heard conflicting people or people with conflicting views saying that how often you should be contacting people. One said, once a month is great. You want to keep them top of mind. One person said once a day, even, especially if you're adding value to their life. It's not always asking for things, but just sharing things that you believe and know, especially if you've got proper segmentation, that they're interested in hearing about. Any particular, like, where do you land in that spectrum? Are you more on the more often is better because top of mind, or don't bother people often and let them, well, what frequency makes sense to you?
It's such a good question with no easy answer because I really think it depends on the organization's vibe and the donor base. Like, I have one client and they're a cat rescue organization, and their donors are cat fanatics, and they love receiving emails, social ad updates, Facebook post updates constantly about the cats who have been rescued and rehabilitated and how they're doing. Like, that brings them joy to hear about that every day. Whereas if it's something, I don't know, more dire or political, that's not so much uplifting sweet news, but more stressful to hear about, receiving those messages every day, I think someone might find really overwhelming. I think it's about making sure that no matter the cadence, that people are getting a good ratio of good news, hopeful, joyful messages, and not just doom and gloom and urgency all the time.
I think cats are an exception. They're a loophole to this whole thing because I
They
don't know
totally are.
anybody who doesn't want to receive some kind of cat news because it just brings everybody joy and happiness. So that's a rare
It is. Cat
loophole.
people are their own, entirely their own thing. And you're right, it's an outlier. In general, I don't think I follow any nonprofits contacting me on a daily basis, but I do follow some who might email a couple of times a week, and I don't read them all. But if I care enough about what they do, I'm not going away.
That's an interesting point, actually, because I have a newsletter myself, right, for junior Salesforce consultants. And the open rate, as far as I can tell, is pretty good. I know open rates in general are not reliable these days with more and more privacy laws. But the idea is the unsubscribes are reasonable, that they're not very many. And I email people 5 days a week. And I've noticed that there's quite a few people that stick around. And I'm actually part of certain newsletters that are also 5 days a week or even 7 days a week. And
Yeah.
as long as they're adding value, as long as the message is not too long, doesn't take too long to read, that it's, 1, 2 minutes, even as short as 300 words, it can add a little bit of spice and variety and interest to your day-to-day type stuff. So I think part of the frequency, in my opinion, is also how not only the topic, like you mentioned, happy, uplifting versus less so, but also how long the message is.
Yes, you're so right. One of my favorite newsletters is one sentence a day, 5 days a week. That's it. It usually has one link in it if I want to go read more on the topic. I absolutely love it because if we're thinking about nonprofits and donors, again, it's that having respect for people's time and emotional bandwidth the same way you would with a friend. Like if it's your best friend, you might text them some short update or ask them how they're doing every day or almost every day, and that works for your relationship.
I also heard there's a certain magical ratio of value added messages to asks. Like you can
Mm.
send these many, you should send these many first without asking anything. You're just sharing information, it's trying to spice up their life in some way. And then after you send this many number, then it's okay to give an ask for an ask or send an email with an ask. I was wondering if your number matches my number.
Oh my gosh. Let me think about what this magic number might be. If we're talking about nonprofits asking for money, I think most do far too much asking versus value delivery. And I would say, even aiming for like 3 to 5 value messages between every ask, I would be very impressed.
So I heard it's 7 to 1. And it's actually the
Mm.
same number in a relationship. If you're with a significant other, it's always good to have 7 positive moments, and it's okay to have one negative moment because those seven generally overpower, overcompensate for the one.
Oh my
But if you
gosh,
start
I need to
having
go tell my husband.
if you start having fewer positive ratios, and then it could be a sign that things need to change because that might be more negative than it should be. So yeah, the 7 to 1 is basically for relationships, and I heard also for value add to ask.
I love it. And most nonprofits are honestly so far from that
Mm.
that any progress in that direction would be great. Today, we're actually recording this on Giving Tuesday. So my email is full of asks. And so many are from organizations that I haven't heard a peep from all year, or I don't really even know who they are. I don't remember. Some of them I actually donated to this time last year, didn't receive anything all year. And now they're asking me for money again, which I can't think of anything worse, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. If you're only contacting people with an ask, then you're most likely not going to get the responses you're looking for.
Nope.
So we talked about frequency. We talked about length. I was curious then about timing because I imagine that like today, by being Giving Tuesday, things are expected to be different today than they are a month ago. Looking at a calendar year, right? If we would divide the calendar year into 4 quarters, right, 3 months each, I would imagine that there are certain activities you can do or should do to strengthen your donor messaging. I was hoping you could maybe highlight a couple of these things, a couple activities per quarter, just to give an idea of where things should land in terms of the calendar year.
Mm-hmm. The nonprofit sector is interesting because to some extent, year-end fundraising forces the calendar to look a certain way. And my clients tend to fall into this sort of wave pattern where they try to do a big fundraiser in the spring and then have some time in between and give people a break before they ask for money again in Q4 or at the end of the year. I think that's a nice way to do it. And the way I try to help them think about it is, okay, so if we're fundraising in the spring and we're fundraising in the winter, how can we use Q1, the beginning of the year, and that kind of dead zone in the summer and fall to just provide a lot of value and do a lot of research and listening to better understand our donors, appreciate our donors, and update them, really update them on what's been going on and the work that they've made possible.
So one in the spring, one in the fall, one in the winter, I should say, and the other ones are more. So if we talk about that 7-to-1 ratio, for example, do you see that applying across the board? Like, would you take that across the calendar year, or is it we talking about across like the next 10 messages? Because if I imagine there has to be some kind of buildup for these two events, and your ratio might be more, more asked because you are building up to it. So is that okay? Is that expected to have like a growth period right before it and then a quieter period where you're maybe giving more value and the ratio tends to be maybe 10-to-1 because you don't need to, yeah, like how do you balance, I guess there's the question between the asks and keeping in mind these two big events?
Yes, I think it's absolutely fine and healthy if there are periods of the year where you're doing more value giving and more asking. And that said, we don't want to fully buy into this cycle of like only really asking for dollars at the end of the year. A nonprofit is happy to have a new donor or a repeat donor any time of the year. And especially if you're investing more in growing your recurring giving program, which is a very wise thing to do, you want to find ways to invite people in to that all year round. But you don't want people feeling like every week, all year, I'm getting an ask or multiple asks to give money to this organization.
And when you're sending out these messages, when you're not the value add, but I'm thinking more going back to that survey because that kind of stuck with me for a second. We talked about how often you said asking the most important question. What is the most important question? Like, what is the most useful piece of information that a nonprofit can know? Like, where do you start segmentation? Is it about a geography, about an interest, about something else? Like, what are you asking for?
Yeah, there's been a real shift from focusing on demographics to focusing on lifestyle and creating sort of value-based or lifestyle-based donor personas. Because there's been a realization that, all 55-year-old women don't donate for the same reason, and they might be completely different. And this 55-year-old woman might actually have more in common with this 22-year-old man in terms of their reason for giving. And so if you can only ask one question, it's why. It's why have you decided to put your hard-earned dollars towards this particular cause right now? And the best time to ask that question is immediately after that person makes their gift. Right on the thank you page, you can embed a form with that one question. You can send them an automated email that's plain text that's coming from a real person, asking them to reply and answer that question. Because if you understand their motivation right when they make the gift, before they've forgotten their motivation and before that sort of feeling of love fades for them, if you can capture them and segment them based on that, then you know that the communication and the content you're delivering year round actually speaks to them. For example, I donate every year to the Endometriosis Foundation because I have endometriosis, and they probably have a lot of donors who have the disease, but also donors whose daughters or family members or friends have the disease. They probably have donors who are medical professionals whose patients have the disease, and those different groups. They could segment people based just asking that one question and kind of get them into the right bucket, if that makes sense.
It does. And it sounds like these are more and should be more open-ended questions. This is not like choose from a list. Here's 5 choices. Hopefully your answer fits in them. It's more like the why. I mean, why
Yeah.
always starts with people have to justify a why, right? They have to explain. It can't be just a yes or no answer. So it sounds like, or I'm interpreting that a why question is a better one, and making sure. I like that question actually. Why did you donate to us to get that motivation? And then based on the answer, then you internally can take that and decide how to segment them based on their answer, whether it's for whatever reason that they give. Any other questions that you would suggest if you had the chance for a second, secondary, also almost as awesome question to ask? What would that be?
Hmm. I think if I could follow up that one very qualitative, open-ended question with something more closed related to how they want their relationship with the organization to look in terms of how often would you love to hear from us, and like which of these topics would interest you the most? Anything like that where you can ask those specific questions and then actually segment appropriately and deliver on that will impress people and make them feel like you actually care about them.
At first value, at first glance, I think that would make sense. But I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second and say that some people don't know how often they want to get notified.
You're so
I,
right.
I know myself, when I started reading a newsletter, again, 7 days a week, I didn't think I was going to be able to hack it. I thought this could be overwhelming. And it's only after a certain period of time where I realized I can digest this, I can read this, I can take it. But if you had asked me at the beginning, I would have said maybe once a week. So
Mm.
how do you calibrate that? Is because I get the respecting their wishes type of approach, but sometimes they don't really know what their wishes truly are.
You're right. And that's why I don't ever recommend asking people whether they want to receive fundraising messages from your organization or not, because a lot of people are going to say no, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't be receptive to the right ask. It may be that focusing more on channel makes more sense. Like, what's your preferred place to be in touch with us or channel to hear from us? That doesn't mean that you can only communicate with them ever on that platform, right? But it is nice to know, like, okay, this person is open to receiving a text message from us, or they really don't want that. If they really don't want that, that's okay.
Let's talk about AI for a second, because you mentioned it earlier and I did want to get around to it. How have you noticed AI impacting the ability to communicate and connect with donors?
I think what's really cool that I'm noticing is AI baked into a lot of new nonprofit tools that are allowing people to conduct more donor research and audience research and analyze that research more easily. So if we think back to me plunking away in that spreadsheet 10 years ago, now you could upload survey responses to ChatGPT, for example, and have it help organize those responses by theme and share key takeaways with you. And certainly, I don't recommend relying solely on AI to conduct or analyze research, but using it as a tool to help expedite that process and also check your own human bias if you're conducting that research. Like sometimes I'll analyze survey results or interview notes for a client and then also upload it to ChatGPT, see what it spits out and see, was there anything big here that I actually wasn't picking up on or was breezing over just because of my own inherent biases?
So you're using it more as a validation tool just to make sure that your analysis works.
I like to use it that way. And of course, also as a content creation helper. And it has a lot of information about philanthropic psychology and donor-centric communication baked in so that if you need a draft of something, a place to start, you can request that, for example, that ChatGPT draft an appeal for you in a donor-centric way focused on these donor motivations, values, and give it enough information based on what you already know about these people to give you a great first draft.
Any other thoughts that you can leave our listeners with to help them in this mission to become more donor centric?
Oh, so many things. I would just really encourage people to think about an unconditional love or friendship with donors. And I learned that lesson participating in a certification course that I absolutely loved with the Institute for Philanthropic Psychology. And sustainable philanthropy. I highly recommend looking into them. But they talk about unconditional love for donors and always communicating them in a way where they feel like you appreciate them just for caring about what you do, regardless of whether or not they make a gift that day. So the appreciation, just like a friend or a family member, isn't tied to them donating. It's tied to them caring, them reading, them staying informed. And if they do give, of course, that's the cherry on top. But thinking about donors that way has really helped me become a better writer and a better communicator and get better results for clients too.
That's actually wonderful advice. And I would add to it by saying that whenever I used to write certain blog posts, I would actually imagine a close friend, and I would imagine writing this message to that person, which helps keep the language human, genuine, authentic. So I would say that would be a great also thing to do to help with your tone.
Yes, pick one specific donor you know is a super fan and write to them.
Awesome. So, Caroline, this has been awesome. Lots of great information. I was hoping that, I imagine that people will hopefully have some follow-up questions. So how can they get in touch with you to learn more about you and then ask those questions?
I would love that. I'm very active on LinkedIn. Please connect with me and DM me there anytime. And you're also welcome to email me, Caroline at marketeronamission.work.
Caroline, thank you so much for everything you're doing. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Alex.
All right, that's it for today. I'm Alexander Lapa, and I hope you join me again in the next Agents of Nonprofit.